Hi, and welcome to GitLab Design Talks. I'm Nick, and I'm here with Mike. Mike, maybe you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Mike Nichols. I'm a senior product designer working on the create stage and the source code group.
Super. And how long have you been here, Mike?
Closing in on 2 years now.
2 years. So 2 years, a lot of experience at GitLab. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about your perspective on how collaboration happens at GitLab.
Yeah, it's I would say what to me it stands out about GitLab and collaboration is the ability to voice your opinion, which sounds like a novel thing, but to me, that's one of the things I love most about GitLab is that's not always the case, right? I mean, that seems like a foregone conclusion here, but a lot of places, if there's political things, there's things you say, there's things you don't say, there's times to bring things up, there's times to not bring things up. And I feel like none of that exists in GitLab, right? So the collaboration happens real time where it needs to happen. It's spread across everything. You're not waiting. I feel like my years previous, you would be like, okay, I have an opinion on that, but I'm not going to voice that until that meeting next week when it's appropriate to do so. Here at GitLab, I have an opinion on that. It's going on an issue. It's going in Slack. I'm raising my voice at a meeting. So, to me, that's what stands out most about the collaboration here is that anybody can do it. It's encouraged. It's welcomed, and there's just so many avenues to do it that it fosters like this world where you can just do it and you're not suppressing collaboration.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting. It seems like that perspective on collaboration is heavily influenced by our value of transparency as well. So the ability just to be transparent in what you're thinking in order to sort of have a perspective and contribute to an issue, an MR, by providing some direction and opinion that you may have. So totally agree. And I know that you've got some interesting perspectives on how iteration and collaboration sort of intersect. So maybe you can tell me a bit about how you and developers have been sort of collaborating in order to make our iteration more effective.
Sure. So I'll give a quick backstory on how what I'm talking about came to be. So we previous to the source code group, I was in the editor group. One of the big things we were working on was snippets, and particularly version control of snippets, which was basically taking those storing those in a database model, tables in a database, and switching that over so they're Git based, right? So the version control, you get all the wonderful things that come with Git. Now that obviously was a large undertaking. That wasn't a one milestoner. It actually spanned almost a year. So at the end of that, that has now been implemented in its place. At the end of that, we did a retro and kind of looked back on how we did overall. And one of the things that came up was the iteration of it. And we actually did spend a great deal of effort breaking things down into small things. That team in particular does a great job of utilizing epics and issues and having lots of small things. So on surface, it would seem like we were doing a great job of iteration. But what we ultimately kind of came out of the retro was that where we lacked in the iteration was planning. So both from a little bit from the engineering side, but I'll let the engineers worry about that. From the product design and product management side, how we broke down the issues wasn't always necessarily aligned with how things got built. So bringing it back to the collaboration, we started having some discussions around like, how can we have more meaningful conversations with engineering to spur on more meaningful iteration? Because it doesn't matter if you break an issue down from a design side into 30 small issues, if that's not how it's going to get built, the efficiency gains that you get out of that iteration really aren't realized. So trying to align those two things through collaboration.
Right. So it seemed like you and your PM work together thinking about how could we ship an MVC and then iterate on top of that. And then when it came to presenting that and handing that over to developers, they actually put a different iteration plan in place just based on technical feasibility and so on.
Yeah, a little bit of that. I mean, there's always there was that, and there's always the, nobody has the crystal ball, right? So I think a lot of times you want to have the conversation with the engineer and say, well, hey, how can I break this thing down for you in the way that you're going to build it? Well, an engineer can tell you that easily at the end when they've done and they're building it, right? It's very difficult to take a year's worth of work and say, here, I know what roadblock I'm going to run into 6 months from now. So there was a combination of that, of just like, what is the MVC? Like you were saying, but also, just how can we get better at anticipating those kind of roadblocks, and how can design and product facilitate a world where engineers aren't forced into more roadblocks than they would naturally run into, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, that seems like a pretty hefty pain point that a lot of people face. And how have you gone about trying to solve for it?
Yeah, so let me share my screen real quick. This is very early stages, and this got a little bit of work into it, but fell off a little bit during the transition to the new stage. But it's something I'm looking to pick up, and actually something that I might be able to pilot with the new stage, because I'm in exactly the right state when I think you would use this. So
maybe you could zoom in just a little bit, please.
Yeah, let me shrink this down, see if that makes it better. I have it giant. Does that help?
Yes.
Gotcha. So the idea is if you're in a situation like I am, maybe you're a designer that has switched roles, or you're new to GitLab. It's difficult to ramp up on a product and really understand the nuances and the details and what all is going into, the feature set that you're now inheriting. Or maybe, maybe it's a new thing, right? Maybe it's a new feature that you're talking about, and this would also apply in that situation. But I think it works better as an example as like the situation I'm in, where I've come into a new area, new set of engineers. I got to try and understand how to work with them. So the thought was to define a template to facilitate a conversation with engineering, to try and identify pain points that might happen. So when doing design work, you can then design around those things, or at least know what those roadblocks were. So really, all that's happened was a little bit of brainstorming, working with Roman and Marcel. Roman was the front end engineering manager on Editor. And we came up with a series of questions that are definitely a first draft. So things like, how complex is the code base? What percentage is front end? What is back end? Is it broken into modules? How is the code grouped? What areas of the code are kind of the no-goes, right? You don't touch this area, it's impossible to change. What areas are kind of open for interpretation or not yet defined? Dependencies, what kind of operations are performance concerns? So questions like that, right? So I think those would lead you to, I think like the performance concerns is a great example. I've run into this a number of times in my career, where you have like a list page, and you have, we always want to put that count at the top, right? Like, say you're applying a filter, and then it's, hey, there's 367 issues now. And then there's always that conversation 3 weeks later when an engineer is like, that will ruin the performance by half, right? Or double the time the ticket loads the page. So identifying things like that, up front, so not the waste of time to put in these counts and these things like that, knowing that they're upfront going to be large performance hits, or at least, maybe, I'm not saying not put them in, but at least have all the information to make an informed decision when you are doing them.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense, and this is certainly something that I've encountered as well when working, is that there's a number of technical constraints, there's a number of feasibility issues that have a significant impact on the end experience, especially handling data, whatever it may be. So this seems like a really nice way for you as a designer to sort of quickly understand those constraints up front in order to incorporate that perspective into your designs to start out with. I think that's really interesting. So maybe you can dive into like the questions here, why you've thought about them in this way, and maybe for someone who's not so technically minded like me, sort of give a bit of an explanation as to why this is important.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one, like how complex is the code base? That one is kind of a ridiculous question, right? It's impossible to answer, and the answer at GitLab is always it's complex, right? So it's kind of a foolish question in that sense, but basically for that one, I'm looking at order of magnitude. You know, is this merge request, right, which we know is a beast? Or is this like feature flags, which is a new thing and it's a smaller code base, right? So it's more of a comparative kind of thing. Just so you can get an overall sense of, is this one of the behemoths here at GitLab or in whatever organization that you're in, or is it a smaller thing? So that one's really just kind of a feeler, order of magnitude type thing. Percentage of front end and back end. So that one I think is important to know. You know, is this a very UI driven feature, right? If it's definitely a front end feature or front end heavy code base, well, that tells you that you're probably going to have a lot of UI associated with this. And if it's heavy back end, you know, a lot of times those are the more interesting ones, right? Those are I click this one button and a lot of magic stuff happens behind the scenes. You know, that's when you really need to think about performance concerns and understanding the flows and understanding what's happening with that. You know, so those two, like just by answering that one simple question, is it front end or back end, would tell you pretty quickly, like what kind of design challenge are you up against here? Am I going to be doing some UI magic, or is this really a understand the flow kind of a problem? Obviously, in both, you know, you got to do both, but you know, it'll tend you in one direction or the other. And then the modules or groups of code. I think that I'm a big believer in kind of the atomic design system. And if you can start understanding what modules the code are broken into, you can also try and align your modules to that. Or actually even really better, right? If we could align design modules to code modules, and have kind of a reusable thing, you know, you can start thinking about like, well, I could use this here and this here and this here, save both design effort, engineering effort, and all that stuff. So that one's really about more that kind of atomic design kind of thinking. The areas where what we're talking about difficult to change, you know, there's some things that you want to change. You know, you'll run across that thing like this has been this problem. And sometimes you're new and you'll come in and you'll bring this up and it's, you know, well, we should really do this. Well, then it's that answer of, yeah, but there's this technical constraint or there's this historical thing to that. So really it's just identifying those areas up front that you know are, not that anything can't be changed, right? I think especially here at GitLab, right? Like we'll take it on if we need to take it on, but just know that some areas are going to require more effort. And you might think that this is a one milestone thing because it's not that big of a change, but that really means that there's 4 milestones of additional effort that will generate. And then the areas that are easy change, right? Those are quick wins, right? It's like, where can I live in a world where, you know, maybe I can clean up some UX debt or some small usability problems that we can breeze through them, we can knock them out, and maybe neither one of them has huge impact, but collectively it'll move the needle. So if you can find areas like that, great. And then what are the dependencies? That one's great because that's an engineer telling you what designer you need to go talk to, right? Because if that engineer knows it's dependent on this area, well, then you just look up that area, you find that designer, and you know, when I touch this, I need to go talk, you know, to that associated designer. So that's that to me is a great driver of collaboration, because the engineers know the code base, they know what depends on what. They can tell you a lot of times, you know, you might not know that this was affected by this, but it's there in the code, you know, there's no way around it. So that's a good trick to get some insights on the collaboration. And then performance concerns, I think I talked about that one a little bit, but there's always those gotchas, you know, there's always these things that you want to add in there. Or if we do it this way, you know, it will drastically ruin performance. So knowing those up front, huge time saver, because finding those out, you know, after you've done the design and having an engineer, well, then you've wasted the design time on it. Or worse, finding that out 3 weeks into a milestone, when, you know, looks like this one's going to slip because this one just is impossible because it's ruining the performance. You know, that's the that's the worst time to find that out. So, you know, and I think that brings up another point. These are both useful for the designers, but also I think it's a great conversation to have with the engineers to make sure the engineers are thinking about these things. So I think it's a two-way street by having these conversations.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, when do you envision these questions being used? You mentioned that it was useful for you as a designer going into a new stage group. How else do you envision using these?
I would think, like, if, you know, if there's a new feature or there's a no new something, right? Hopefully, eventually, in your stage group, you would have, and you yourself, as a designer, would be able to answer these questions. So I guess the easiest way to answer that, in my opinion, would be whenever you don't know the answers to these questions, right? So if you're a new area, or if it's a new feature, or it's, you know, something gets shuffled around and you inherit something else, or maybe even if you like are looking to expand into another area, right? If you're collaborating, you know, if there was a world where maybe these answers were documented somewhere and I got to collaborate with you, Nick, well, if I can go find these answers, now that collaboration is even easier because I know what the things I can't change are, or things that I can change, right? So maybe there's a world where this eventually makes its way into a kind of a part of the vision page, or something like that, you know. I mean, it's obviously still in its very early stages, but, you know, I could see it being beneficial at that level.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think this is something that I'll definitely be paying close attention to as well, because I think my team would definitely benefit from it. What I've noticed here is that this actually pairs really nicely with the perspective that Hayana was talking about in our previous conversation. And what this is doing is, if you have design and implementation, this is basically bringing some of that implementation knowledge into the design side. So you as a designer have a little bit of that in your head while you're making the designs. And what Hayana was doing was saying, well, how about if we create an easier to understand share vision that all the developers can get behind, so that they can also provide input further up on the design side, on how implementation may go. So I feel like this is like a really interesting combination crossover where you as a designer are able to empathize more effectively with the engineers and what they're going
Right.
through. And then maybe Hayana's side is more like, here's how you as a designer can more effectively communicate what this vision should be, so developers feel empowered to, like, as you were talking about before, be transparent, communicate what they want to say, and have a perspective on everything. Because I suppose
Yeah.
everyone can contribute, everyone can contribute, and that means that everyone could be a designer, everyone can sort of have a perspective on how something should be shaped. So I
Yep.
think that's really complimentary. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So got a couple of minutes left. I suppose I'd love to know, like, if there is a piece of advice you could give someone around collaboration who's a new joiner coming into GitLab, what would that advice be?
Uh, it's been said a number of times, GitLab is a company of introverts, right? And the hardest thing to get over at GitLab, I think when you first join, if you're an extrovert, you're probably all right. But we skew towards introverts.
Mm-hmm.
I think the hardest thing is just getting out there, right? Get involved. Like, it's hard to make your first comment on an issue. It's easier to make your 10th, and it's a lot easier to make your 100th, and it's no problem to make your 1,000th. Jesus, that's a hard word to say. It's not as bad as everybody can contribute, but we've stumbled here at the end of this thing.
Getting tired.
Yeah. But no, I mean, that to me was the thing, right? Like, a lot of times I would stop and I would think about something, and I wouldn't want to comment or whatever unless I had what I believe to be a well thought through point to make. And I think collaboration is best when it's off the cuff, just like we're doing right now, right? We're just spitballing ideas back and forth. No planning went into this. We're just saying things, and ideas flow that way. And to get yourself into that mode, the easiest way to do it is just to do it. And it sounds crazy, but I mean, that to me is always the hard thing at GitLab to get over.
Yeah, I hear you. And once you get over it, it opens up a lot of doors. So I think that's some great advice. Mike, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye-bye.